For the Hindu community in North America, this is the age of anxiety. Over the past decade and a half, there have been systematic attempts at attacking the Hindu community. Among the many examples are attempts at influencing the K-12 social studies curricula in California and elsewhere, caste resolutions in city councils and states, which explicitly malign the entire religion and culture of Hindus. There have also been targeted attacks at Hindu Americans, including accomplished entrepreneurs who contribute significantly to the economy of the state and the country. Now, these initiatives have been undertaken by a few motivated individuals and groups. Indeed, it's worth noticing the extent of support and resonance from state institutions as well. For example, the textbook controversy in California involved the California Board of Education. In the Seattle case, there was a city council of a major West Coast metropolis. In the Cisco case, it was the California Civil Rights Department. Now, how do we understand these phenomena? What are the motivations of those who act against the Hindu diaspora communities? To answer these questions, we have two distinguished academic scholars. Dr. Prakash Shah is a reader of culture and law at St. Mary's College at the University of London. Trained as a lawyer at the London School of Economics and at SOAS in London, he specializes in cultural diversity in law, religion and law, caste and law, immigration, refugee and nationality law, and comparative law. Professor Shah is a prolific writer. He's an author of more than 3 single-authored books: Against Caste in British Law, Legal Pluralism in Conflict, and Refugees, Race, and the Legalist Concept of Asylum in Britain. He's also the editor of 5 books and an author of several articles. Moreover, he's the editor of the book series on cultural diversity in law with the prestigious Routledge Company. Professor Shah also serves as a referee for various British and European grant-making bodies, including the British Academy, the Arts and Humanities Board, the Economic and Social Research Council, and the Austrian Science Fund, the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research, and the European Research Foundation, amongst many others. He also referees for leading academic journals and for publishers including Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, Routledge, and Sweet Maxwell. In addition to all of this, Dr. Shah serves as an editorial board or advisory board member of a number of leading academic journals. Our other guest today is Professor Makrand Paranjpaye. He's the Director of Education at Access Healthcare Physicians LLC in Florida, educated at St. Stephen's College, Delhi, and the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He has had a distinguished academic career, most recently as a professor at the School of Language, Literature, and Cultural Studies at JNU. Among other things, he served as a distinguished director of the prestigious Indian Institute for Advanced Studies in Shimla. Dr. Paranjpaye has won a stunning array of international awards and honors and has been invited to most of the world's leading institutions. He is also one of the most prolific authors I've ever encountered. He's published no less than 16 academic books, 6 books of poetry, 3 books of fiction. He's edited more than 20 books, if I counted correctly, and has translated a book from Marathi to English. And if this is not enough, he's published more than 200 refereed papers and more than 1,000 essays, book reviews, and occasional papers. This was a scholar before ChatGPT. Professor Paranjpaye has also served as a general editor of a series of reprints of rare and out-of-print English titles published by the Sahitya Academy in New Delhi. He's the founder editor of a number of journals, including Evam. He served as a member of the editorial boards of journals all over the world, in the Americas, in Europe, and in Asia. Gentlemen, welcome to our program.
Thank you.
I'd like to begin, if I may, with some historical clarifications. Firstly, is caste an essential feature of Hinduism? I'd like to call on you, Prakash, first, given that you've played a key part in some of the most novel and exciting scientific research programs on the subject. Can you tell us about this body of research?
Yes, sure. A quick reply to your question would be yes, if you're a Protestant missionary in the 19th century writing about India, because that's where we get our dominant account of Hinduism and caste and the connection between them. And since then, that account has been seeping into the social sciences and into popular consciousness everywhere in the world, including India. So this is how we think about the caste system today and the religion of Hinduism. Now, why do I say that? Because I've been the beneficiary. I've had the good fortune of witnessing the production, reading the production of a great deal of research within a research program run by a professor called S.N. Balagangadhara, based at the University of Ghent in Belgium. And I regard it as the best research program in India, in the world, on India in the world. And there are many reasons for that, which I can't go into right now. But it's a very prolific research program, and part of what they've addressed is the problem of Hinduism and the caste system. Now, my own role in this has been quite minimal. But with respect to caste, that's been a sort of point of my focus for the last decade, a little bit more than a decade. I've been part of a journal special issue of a Czech historical journal where we address the question of caste collectively. These are members from the research program and satellite people to the research program like myself. Also, I've been co-editor of a book published by Paul Grave on, which is titled The Western Foundations of the Caste System, also an edited collection. And most recently in 2023, we released a special journal issue of a socio-legal studies journal, which is based in Spain, on the caste system as well. So we're trying to excavate this territory as much as we can so far. And this is among the points of departure actually that we've made, but we've also deepened this account. So we're convinced in our research program that actually the conception of Hinduism in the caste system is not Indian. It actually derives from a Western account of India.
Thank you. If I can follow up with you, as somebody who studied the caste system in the Indian context, what would your response be?
My straightforward response would be no. Caste is not an essential part of the Hindu system or Hinduism, for the simple reason, as we've heard, that caste itself as a category of analysis was invented in the 19th century or thereabouts, and Hinduism or Sanatana Dharma or the tradition that came to be called Hindu is much more than obviously a couple of hundred years old, though some Orientalists actually say it's only a couple of hundred years old. So if Hinduism is more than 200 years old, and if the caste system as a mode or method of analysis is only 200 years old, then obviously caste cannot be the essential feature of Hinduism. And I can give you a better example. Dr. Babasaheb Bhimrao Ambedkar said untouchability was an essential feature of Hinduism. But after untouchability was abolished legally and gradually went away socially as well, Hinduism still persists. And another way to answer this question is that the indigenous categories of understanding both social stratification and identification are not at all in the caste, idiom. They are actually jati varna. And if you look at jati varna, then that is a much more, I think, complex way of understanding who we are, because jati is hereditary and actually genetic, and varna is ascriptional. It's based on social ordering. And if you look at the jati varna system, then it's almost universal. You ask anyone in the US, they'll all tell you, I'm part Irish, part English, or I'm French, part Caribbean, whatever. Everyone has a jati identifier to tell us who they are. And also a varna, by that I mean your professional identification. You can be a teacher, you can be a policeman, you can be a shopkeeper or a businessman, or you can be a worker. You can be a blue-collar worker, a white-collar worker, or whatever. So some of these are almost universal, and they're not, as it were, confined to the Hindu system. And that's why if you were to say that caste equals Hinduism, I think that's a very erroneous type of, I would say, equation. And in fact, it's highly motivated, and one would look for it, not as a conspiracy, but one would look at the motivations that go behind the mobilization of that sort of opinion, and actually pry that open and try and do something against that sort of identification.
I'd like to raise a couple of points to think about further, if I may. First of all, a lot of Indians today do identify with caste. It's, if you ask an average, scratch the backs of an average Indian and ask them, what is your caste identity? They will actually have an answer, many of them. Again, the average American, to counter your thing, might say, yeah, okay, I'm a shopkeeper today, but it's not hereditary. How would you respond?
Well, absolutely. There's a wonderful way to respond to this that Professor Arvind Sharma said. He said that in the modern period, we are all the varnas. Each one of us performs tasks which are identified traditionally, with one varna or the other. So when I'm cleaning my house, I'm one varna. When I'm teaching my child, I'm another varna, for instance. When I'm doing my finances at the end of the day, I'm another varna. And let's say I'm protecting my family, against an intruder, or even not an intruder, but you might say a salesperson who's knocking on my door, then I'm another varna. So the toggling and the mixture of the varnas is not varna sankara of the kind that the Gita talks about, which is supposed to be catastrophic, but it's just a routine part of modern life. But when you say that we all identify with the caste, I'm not really sure, because I feel that what the colonial administration did, which is make caste a part of governmentality, was actually carried forward by the post-colonial Indian state. So how does one know what anybody's caste is? Caste as social capital is actually guaranteed by the Indian state, because it gives you a piece of paper which then entitles you to a job or to a seat in a college. And therefore, caste has now become social capital to be mobilized. So one should rethink this whole idea of caste, because there are entire political parties which mobilize on the basis of caste. So the point is that caste is as much a means or a vehicle of upward mobility as it is of keeping people oppressed. So we have to rethink all of these categories: caste, which is a modern idea, jati and varna, which were traditional ideas, but their transformations over time.
Thank you very much. Now, I am going to move on and address another question to you, Prakash. Who and what is a Dalit? Can you tell us, as a law professor, what the legal definition of a Dalit is, please?
No, I cannot, because there is no legal definition for what a Dalit is. Today, of course, the term Dalit is used, in journalistic parlance, in scholarly writing, in political discourse. So one would think that there's some kind of definite kind of content to this idea, but actually it's a political term, or a term of political mobilization. The nearest, I suppose, you can get to a legal term of it, and the term Dalit is often used as being equivalent to what the Indian legal system today refers to as scheduled castes, right? But these are basically just a list of castes which are made up and listed in the Indian constitution. And I suppose you could extend that and say, well, many of the lists that apply at state level in India are also constitutive of this larger category of Dalit or scheduled caste. But that's about all there is to it. Now, one thing, there are, I suppose, two routes that one can take from that point. One is, how did the category of scheduled castes arise? It refers back to what the British used to refer to as depressed classes. Right? Now, the term depressed class is an agglomeration of different jati groups, different social groups, and so on, which they had delineated originally in the census. Right? And the reason why certain groups of people became classified as depressed classes is because of extremely arbitrary criteria such as ritual status. Right? That's not a scientific conception. It's actually some arbitrary thing which some British administrator thought, oh well, you seem to be, I don't know, you seem to have an air of ritual impurity about you, so you must be a lower caste. right? So those kinds of things went into the idea of depressed classes, and today we inherit that as scheduled castes. Now, just to round off the point, when one asks the legal question about Dalits, who are Dalits, it becomes very important in Western jurisdiction, because the legal mobilization has been done according to the category of Dalit, right? And so now Western legal systems are under a pressure to answer this very same question. And how are they going to do it? They can't refer back to the Indian courts, or can they? I don't know. Right? So it opens up a Pandora box for them as well.
Makrand, going beyond the legal, can you tell us a bit more about the emergence of this term and its meaning and significance in India?
Well, certainly the term Dalit became popular much more recently than the idea of depressed classes or scheduled castes, and also there are tribes, you see, who are in the schedule. And it actually is something that came out of a literary movement in Maharashtra. They call themselves the Dalit Panthers, and going back to the 70s. And then it became, so popular, it had a social cachet, and it also became accumulative. It could, you could jump on the bandwagon, and and therefore they tried to back project it to the writings of Ambedkar himself. But if you trawl through his writings, he hardly ever uses that word. He uses untouchables over and over again. Now, another interesting part of this word Dalit is its etymology. If you go to the Sanskrit meaning, it means something that is broken or separated or fragmented. That's how you get the word dal. You eat dal and rice, almost every day. So that process of grinding, in a way we might say that we've all been ground through some system of breakage or breaking. But there's another wonderful aspect of it, which is the dal or dala, and therefore Dalit also means opening up. When you separate the chaff from the seed, you're also opening up. It's not just entirely negative, as it has come to be seen. But the important thing is it's not a jati category. There's no genetic basis for the word Dalit. And to go back to what Prakash Bhai was saying, you can't define it, and unless you point back to the Indian schedule of caste. And if you do, then you'll have to say scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other backward castes, OBC, etc., other backward communities, they're not Dalit. So, in other words, this is an invented category, and I would even go so far as to say it has been mobilized by the brokers of backwardness, in other words, to browbeat both the state and to some extent private organizations to derive benefits. And that is why one needs to interrogate this category and ask what it really means to be a Dalit. Interestingly, the Dalit Panthers said anybody can be a Dalit, anybody who identifies with that cause. But you also have a reverse sort of purity when it comes to the privileged Dalits, when they say that, oh, you're only 1/4 Mahar, for instance, so you're not really pure enough to belong to the lineage of Dr. Ambedkar.
Well, let's talk about Hinduism now. So Hinduism, if I may use that word, and a Western word, may well be understood, at least we understand it, as a self-correcting system, as opposed to, for example, other systems of religious spiritual practice which derive from a book or a set of doctrines. Hinduism has always evolved over time. Many traditions, such as the Bhakti movement and others written of and understood today as reformist, have explicitly addressed very difficult issues, including social stratification and social justice issues, and have offered ways forward. It's always been correcting in that sense. Makrand, can you tell us a bit about some of the examples from more recent history, and particularly the modernization of Hinduism, the Hindu modernists, from Roy, Raja Raman Roy, to Vivekananda, and especially Aurobindo, Sri Aurobindo, on whom you're one of the great authorities in the world?
Well, I want to say that all traditions are self-correcting, not just Sanatani traditions, not just Hinduism. Otherwise, they wouldn't be traditions. Anything which exists for a very long time, if you even look at the Catholic Church, it's gone through so many convulsions, in fact, so many, reforms and so many doctrinal changes. But what makes our tradition so special is it doesn't have one book, one deity, one god, or any one priest or one central authority. It's diversity. But speaking of Indian modernity, which is really one of the main lines of my work, I think its great contribution to the world is, in my view, that it's not counter-systemic as certain other modern traditions are, where they want to be anti-West or they want to bring down the West. Nor is it, should I say, subservient to Western modernity, which was seen as the, manifest destiny of humanity, that those who did not belong to Western modernity or could not enter into its hallowed portals were doomed to extinction, like the so-called primitive indigenous tribes of the world. They've all become extinct because they couldn't become modern. So I think Hinduism and India offers a great exception to this, which is that you're not counter-systemic, you don't want to destroy the modern world, you want to participate in it, you accept reason, but not the supremacy of reason. So you don't want to replace reason, with either faith or anger or resentment, but you want to replace it where you have illumination, the transformation of consciousness, yoga. These become, so to speak, higher values than reason, without rejecting reason, which also means you don't reject modern science, you don't reject technology. And Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo, I think, are exemplary, but there were others, including Gandhi, who wanted to understand modernity and not just reject it outright. And the great thing that they discovered is that modernity, as we understand it, is self-destructive. It has the seeds of self-destruction. And you are a professor of environmental science, ecology. You see, without dharma and moksha, just kama and artha take you to self-destruction. And I think the great contribution of India is to save modernity from eating itself up like Bhasmasura. And I think the great Indian mystics and spiritual sages and gurus of the last 200 years have opened this wormhole, as it were, to take us from this dire situation that we are in to some possibility of a global consciousness revolution.
I'd like you to expand on this light more with an example before I go back to you, Prakash, if I can. So you're, in essence, bringing up the significance of the Purusharthas. But tell us with an example, I mean, pick Vivekananda, pick Sri Aurobindo, pick anybody, how this translates concretely into the project of, in a sense, redeeming modernity, if I may say so?
Well, the first important thing, at least for people like both Vivekananda and Aurobindo, was India's independence, because Indian modernity, as it were, was contaminated by colonialism. That was the way in which we received modernity. And this is linked up to our question about caste as well. Because when you look at these Hindu reformers from Ram Mohan Roy onwards, hardly anybody, there are maybe one or two exceptions, like in the Gaudiya Parampara, but they were against Varnashram Dharma as was understood. Vivekananda famously said he was against Adhikaravada. That means hereditary or inherited authority to study the scriptures. He said anybody could do it, anybody who was fit. Dayanand Saraswati said, and somehow Dr. Ambedkar doesn't refer so much to Dayanand Saraswati, who was a very radical reformer. He said anybody can study the Vedas, and in fact he said a so-called Brahmin, person born in a Brahmin family, if he was not, intellectually able, should be in his ashram or in his setups sent to sweep the floor and do other, so to speak, menial tasks, and he would take a so-called scheduled caste person to study the Vedas, and the Arya Samaj actually did it. So it is so ironic that the so-called Savarna reformers or leaders of thought in India were all anti-caste, and yet it is the Savarnas who have been dubbed as the great villains in this whole, so to speak, caste calculus. And I think this is one of the ironies that we need to, as it were, expose and explore, because we are interested in knowledge and truth. So it's not a battle between Savarnas and Dalits as it's been made out. It's really a battle between knowledge and ignorance, and motivated ignorance, and truth and untruth, as we've seen in the Sundarayar case, so much untruth, deliberate, obfuscation and deliberate, I would even say, lies. So we are really fighting that. We are not trying to bring back, some form of varnashram system. We are not apologists for caste hierarchy. We are not, saying everything was wonderful in the Indian tradition. No, but we want to understand what we critique. And I think that has been the thrust of Indian modernity.
Indeed, I'd describe the Cisco case as I wouldn't hesitate to call it a Ponzi scheme of lies. It really is. But following up with you, Prakash, as a Hindu originally from Kenya and partially and significantly raised in the UK where you live, what are your thoughts on this subject of Hindu modernity, modernization?
I think I have a slight point of nuance or difference here, I think, because yes, we can look at a lot of Indian reformers in recent history, let's say in the last 200 years or so, particularly those associated with British colonial rule and so on, associated in terms of periodization, not complicit necessarily. But if we now argue that they themselves were against the caste system, I'll use that word if you don't mind. If we now argue that they were against the caste system, what is the caste system, the entity of the caste system they're referring to? Are they referring to the concoction that was created by the British or the Anglo-Protestant missionaries? Is that the version of the caste system that they actually had in mind, which they thought were fighting? And I think this is a kind of disability that we see right down to our present day. Because when we see legislation and case law and so on, litigation being brought in Britain, in the United States and so on, one of the weaknesses that we have is that we still want to, part of us wants to be seen as fighting the caste system, as being against injustice, as being for social justice. But I would question that. I would say, in what terms are we presenting ourselves as advocates for social justice? If it's to fight a fictitious entity that doesn't belong to us, then I would say, be done with it. Don't argue against the conception of the caste system in that way. I would say you have to have a more foundational critique and say, this is not our creation. This is what you created and imposed on us as a conceptual framework, right? Not as a system, but as a conceptual framework. And once we start to tackle it in that way, I think we can begin to rip it apart. I'm not saying it's going to be overnight. It's not going to win you an individual law case or make them take away one piece of legislation and so on, because there's a lot of intellectual work that has to go into it. But I think that's the better route, rather than following the footsteps of the reformers from the recent history of India.
Can I respond
You may
briefly?
respond, yeah, please.
Yes, so I would agree with Prakash to an extent, which is that we needn't engage with the system that we call the caste system, especially on the terms that we received from the colonial former masters. But, there's stuff like temple entry, there's stuff like, keeping people away from things. There are oppressions on the ground. These, we have to, Gandhiji, Vaikom Satyagraha, and we see Gandhiji as starting out by, campaigning against untouchability, fasting, raising funds, and yet saying, in its essence, Varnashram Dharma was not what the colonial administrators and others are saying it was. But towards the end of his life, he said, I don't want even to bless a same caste union. I only want, the whole thing has to go root and branch. Now, whatever name you want to call it, in whatever way you want to defend it or define it. So I think at the conceptual level, I seem to agree, but at the practical, at the social level, things are different, I think.
That's a very important corrective. I hear neither of you in any sense at all condoning any form of social dissonance, injustice, whatever.
No, we don't deny that. I don't think either of us would say, there's no injustice in the world, or there's no injustice in India or in the Indian immigrant community in places like the United States. That's not the point. The point is, what is the best way to capture the experience of people, right? And if somebody like Sundar says, I did everything I could with the best of intentions, and yet I'm being accused because of a reliance on a framework that is happening to me or being applied to me despite everything that I've done. And that's a conundrum that we need to break. Why does that happen? How does that happen?
Indeed. I'd like now to take the discussion in a slightly different trajectory. What has been the liberal Indian tradition's understanding of an engagement with Sanatana Dharma? I'm talking about the Congress tradition, of course, 70 years of Congress rule, but also others, the Marxists, Kosambi, for example. Why do they seem to have a problem with Sanatana Dharma in a manner in which they don't seem to have any other religious or indeed secular formulation? What's the problem?
Once again, it's a problem with terminology. Who are the liberals? You see, the liberal category is also something we question.
No,
For example,
I'd specifically say in this particular question, we've the Congress Party, the Delhi intellectuals, the Khan Market gang, call it what you want.
Yeah, but these are all very different. I mean, the Congress, the traditional Congress was a big tent. Everyone was included, from the left to the right. You had Madan Mohan Malaviya, who was one of the founders of the Hindu Mahasabha, as a proud member of the Congress. And then you had
Shyama Prasad Mukherjee for a while.
Shyama Prasad Mukherjee also. Even Hedgewar was a part of the Congress for a while. But on the other hand, extreme left people were in the Congress as well, and socialists like Achyut Patwardhan, and a whole lot of them who went underground, Aruna Asaf Ali, 1942. But the real point is, take Gandhiji as an example. You know, he was one of the greatest liberals, but he was also one of the greatest conservatives. He said, I'm a Sanatani Hindu, over and over again. So we have to use these words differently, is all I'm saying. Because which tradition in the world has emphasized liberation, the liberal, mukti, moksha, kaivalya, nirvana, more than the Sanatanis? I don't know anyone who has placed a greater premium on freeing ourselves, you know, from every form of constraint, not just economic liberalism or social liberalism, which are actually at odds with each other. So, or enlightenment, not 18th century enlightenment, but enlightenment of the Buddha under the Bodhi tree. So we have to use these terms with an Indian resonance. But to answer your question, really, I mean, Kosambi is a very interesting case because he was, in a way, disavowed by the Marxists, and he came up with a very interesting phrase. He said, I'm not among the Om variety of Marxists. So the Om variety, or orthodox Marxists, were those, he said to me, that is to Kosambi, he said that Marxism is a way of thinking, not a substitute for thinking. You know? so what I'm trying to say is that what do we mean by the, but you know, to answer your question really, Sanatana Dharma or Hinduism was the big fear of somebody like Nehru, because he felt that the Congress would be dislodged from power through a majoritarian kind of political mobilization, whereas his idea of the Congress was a minoritarian coalition. And so he kept banning the RSS, he kept pushing aside all Hindu identifications. And when Rajendra Prasad, the President of India, wanted to inaugurate Somnath, he boycotted the event. But the Congress didn't all agree with him. In fact, on the day previous to the Indian Independence Day, there was a big yagya where Rajendra Prasad himself, you know, was the Yajaman, and the Sengal came to Nehru, as we know. So there's a lot of fudging around the Congress's, you know, dealings with Hinduism.
But at some point it changes, doesn't it? I mean, by about the early 80s, for example, there was very much a disavowal in a more state-driven ideology, if you will. I mean, the Congress clearly, by the 1980s...
more and more, I would say more and more, and especially in recent times. I have checked the Wikipedia page of the Congress, and it was completely rewritten by the so-called Lelis in recent years. And I think because they're still more or less talking that...
Let's talk 42nd Amendment.
Exactly. Yeah. But the reason they did it is they saw the rise of BJP as a political force, and they panicked more and more. And now they've done a U-turn, you know, with Kamal Nath doing a Ram thing, with Rahul Gandhi himself going to all kinds of temples, saying, I'm a Janeyodhari. He invokes his Kashmiri Pandit heritage. Yeah. So the schizophrenia of the Congress party and of, in fact, Hindu liberals when it comes to Sanatana Dharma is really obvious. But with the Marxists, there's a much different, I mean, it's more complicated. And I think it's Mother Russia or Father China or whatever. And that in a sense, makes them complicit in a way which is really much more dangerous and much more destructive of all traditions, but more so of Sanatan Dharma, because that is the big obstacle for them. In fact, if you notice what happened to the Pakistan Communist Party, it merged with the Muslim League. And so they, in Kerala and elsewhere, they are in cahoots with, in fact, radicals, from the other side, because it's an alliance between Marxists, Islamists, and many other kinds of anti-Sanatanis, which you actually see right here in California.
And you see the church in India making other kinds of...
The missionaries, the mullahs, the Macaulayeites, the Panchamakara, if you like. Some even put Mahatma Gandhi in that. Yeah. But,
But I think it's time to ask Prakash to weigh in on this very topic. If you
Yeah, I don't need to say much, but I think Makrandji has said quite a lot already. You mentioned the term Sanatan Dharma, and recently I'm sure it escapes none of you that there was a quite intense debate, if not long-lasting debate, about Sanatana Dharma in India.
Udaygiri Stalin.
Indeed.
Quite. Appropriately named.
Udaynidhi, rather.
And there was a lot of press commentary, intellectuals weighed in, and so on. So I read one contribution by an intellectual. I'm not sure if I should name him, but he's actually safely ensconced in an American university right now, I believe Princeton University, in the Indian Express. And I found it really shocking, disappointing at least, but quite shocking actually. The way he could talk about Sanatana Dharma and caste oppression in the same breath. And here I don't see any development of thinking. Like it's almost as though we've frozen in time since the early 19th century. That we're not able, today you began the session asking what's the connection between Hinduism and the caste system, right? This commentator would agree that there is an absolute, intimate, kind of interlinkage between the two entities. So how far have we progressed intellectually since the days of the Anglo-Protestant missionaries? I fear not very far.
I might
what
add
we've
just a
maybe
word.
accomplished.
No, I think we are regressing. We are not progressing, and it's done with a motivation. Because one of the things I wrote about in reference to what happened with Sundar and SB 403 is their plan was actually to bring it back to India, to the private sector.
Yeah.
So this was the lab. Equality Labs, if I were to name them, or any other such lab, was really an experiment to see that if you can get away with it in Seattle or in the Silicon Valley, next the Tatas and the Birlas and the Infosys campuses would be, as it were, invaded, if not infested, with similar people holding up a stick and saying, we will teach you.
Let's talk about that a bit more. I do have a question for both of you about the nature of Dalit politics. And again, I don't know which way to go, but let's start with India. Let's start with you. Could you elaborate and tell us a bit more about the history of this kind of mobilization? When does it start? I think I have the sense that it's relatively recent. It doesn't go back very far, maybe 20, 30 years. But what are the key goals of this particular genre of Dalit politics? Who are the actors? What are the motivations? If you could just elaborate a bit more in the Indian context. And then I'll ask you a similar question about the UK and the United States.
So Ravi, I like to, make a distinction between positive Ambedkarism and negative Ambedkarism.
Sure.
But the ingredients are there. Ambedkar also negotiated, bargained very hard with the Congress for the so-called pound of flesh that he secured for his, constituency. And he bargained hard with Gandhiji. There was a fast. He bargained at the round table. And then those provisions were entered into the Constitution, as we know, and persisted for a long time, though he never won an election. And I think it was retooled by people like Kanshiram and Mayawati more recently. But something amazing has happened, which is that these parties have failed, parties which were purely caste-based or even dynastic. And this is because of the amazing inventiveness of, I would say, Narendra Modi and Amit Shah, because they have weaned away some of these vote banks. In UP, there's been, I would say, caste engineering of an unprecedented kind, where all kinds of so-called Dalit and backward communities are now major supporters, not only of the BJP, but of the Ram Janmabhoomi movement and so on. So I think that in India we are seeing a complete overturning And we are seeing people who want to belong to the mainstream, because as I said, one meaning of the word Dalit is the fragmented one, the broken one, the one who has been, cast aside. And now all of these people want to join in a different kind of aspirational India. But I think abroad it's playing out in a completely opposite fashion, where I think that's where maybe Prakash can come in.
Yeah, I'd like to ask you, particularly with reference to the spate of court cases, legislative moves, and if you could speak to us first in the context of the UK,
Right.
and then in the US. You've got a potential law in the UK. You've also got a major case. Can you tell us a bit about that, and then the US, maybe California.
Let me pick up on Makrandji's reference to equality labs, because the lab idea is very interesting. I think the UK was a lab, actually, has been a lab for the first caste-related legislation that was passed in any Western country. Seattle followed suit, and then California. And there's been litigation also. In fact, the leading legal expression we have against caste discrimination in Britain today is actually established case law. And this is exactly what they were trying to do with the Cisco case in California, right? Once, maybe in a reverse fashion, but we don't need to go into detail with respect to that. So the Dalit mobilization has been through various NGOs as the core actors, but they've established links with academics. They've established links with political actors. They've established links with national official institutions. So you see that here in California, for example, with the CRD activism against caste. In Britain, we have the example of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is our national equalities body, official one. But I think this coalition of interests has not just been a national one. And I think we shouldn't look at them in isolation. Some of the very same actors who are active in California and other places in the United States are also the very same people who've been organizing in Britain. And at the very same time, in fact, probably slightly earlier, there's been mobilization at United Nations level. So various of the United Nations human rights organs, special rapporteurs, the Committee on Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and so on, they've already been, can I use the word captured? So effectively, there's been some kind of institutional capture. So we have a very organized set of people, very motivated, if I may, and very determined to get what they want. And I'm not really, if you're an opposer of these kinds of interests, then you have your job cut out for you, actually.
I'd like to pose another question related to both of you, especially stemming from this idea of capture. By capture, you're really referring to the overwhelming presence of this kind of thinking, if you will, in key sectors, government, law, media, especially academia.
Also, yes.
What is it going to take to allow Sanatic voices to gain a foothold? Is it more scholarship? Is it more money? What is it?
Well, I think I want to present a slightly contrarian point of view. I think this is a wake-up call, and it has served to mobilize the community. And I think the United States is very important, because if you show the way here, it will follow. In fact, the colonial...
What is the way?
The way is to mobilize, to raise consciousness, to vote the right people, to make noises.
No, we can do all that. They're doing all that. And yet, there's very little representation in the academia and the media.
No, it's
and in
changing.
fact, equality doesn't exist.
It's changing. It's changing gradually. And I think we need to recognize the value of intellectual work, because that lasts. Activism is more short-lived.
That's what I'm asking.
And the kind of work that Professor Balu has done, Bal Gangadharji and his school, it's very important. And there are others who are doing it, like Oxford Center for Hindu Studies. And in India, I have always been an advocate of high-level academics, not just ideologically motivated academics, but people are not yet aware of it. They want instant results. So I think this careful work, we have to think about the next 100 years, and we have to think about our own children. And really, we have to think about our own practices, because our children, they don't do as we say, they do as we do. And in fact, but I'm again saying that I see the US as a place of hope, because outside of India, even something like temple building, which people dismiss as not being intellectually significant, there are more Hindu temples in the US than anywhere else in the world outside India, or maybe Nepal. So there is much to be done here, and we have broken through the glass ceiling in this country. There's an Indian origin vice president, and et cetera, et cetera. So we are everywhere, and I think that if we show the way forward, which is through knowledge, through reasonable conduct, through the following of dharma, if we become exemplars of the alternative, which is this binary oppositional discourse, which is meant to secure gains, almost browbeating, bullying, cancelling, blackmailing people, targeting people, targeting Sanatana Dharma. We are moving targets for this kind of hate speech. We don't have to return hate speech with hate speech. We have to provide a different kind of discourse, which is inclusive and which everyone sees as the way forward. And the last thing I wanted to say, by the way, is that all communities which came to America as immigrants had to go through this phase. You can see it in literature. There's a poster of The Godfather right outside the studio, and Italian Americans, Jewish Americans, Irish Americans, Hungarian Americans, everyone, Polish Americans, they all had to go through this process. And I think it's the time of Indian Americans to also, go through that process and shine, I feel.
Looking at the UK context in which the Indian presence has been significantly for a longer period of time, what do you see as a prospect of, on the outside when I look at it, there's very little representation or presence, if you will, of Hindu tradition, Sanatana tradition people in the media or in the academia. So what do you think is the problem there?
Yeah, I mean, you phrased the question in a very interesting way, because I noticed you didn't say people of Indian background or nominal Hindus,
Exactly.
right? You're talking about a particular variety of person, albeit they may be of Indian origin. I mean, I would actually want to echo what Makrandji said in terms of having a mature intellectual discourse, which is an alternative to what we have today. And actually that's what we lack. We lack that in Britain, which is why pretty much what I've seen in the United States as well, but also in Britain, that we actually lacked an alternative account which we could use to convince the politicians, the media people, and so on, right? And those things don't happen overnight. They actually need to be there before the media people, the politicians, and so on will pick it up, right? And so there you've got, it's not so much about institution building in Western countries, because I think the institutions are there, actually. We need to make them work for us, right? And to ensure that there is a maturation of some kind of alternative intellectual discourse which can present a different story, basically. Yeah, okay, I'll stop there.
If I may add a footnote.
But a quick footnote.
Very quick.
Let's
not forget that Rishi Sunak, the current Prime Minister, is a practicing Hindu. And he has...
Performatively, at least.
Yeah, those performances are important.
They are important.
Because rather than being seen as savage and primitive, I mean, by the way, I also want to say Hindus are not just fighting for Hindus.
Yeah, of course.
Sanatana Dharma is a way, is an invitation to all of humanity. It belongs to all of humanity, and it has wonderful things. And these are the wonderful features we want to present.
Yeah.
And some are already accepted, like yoga.
I want to turn to something else.
Please, I know we're running short of time, but just to pick up on what you've said, which is quite important. So it's no good just having Hindus. And you rightly say that Hindus are not just fighting for Hindus and so on. If an alternative account or discourse is going to be credible, it needs buy-in from other people as well. Mm-hmm. So as researchers, for example, we shouldn't just be promoting Hindus, right? It's the intellectual merit of the case that we're making, not in an activist sense, but in an intellectual sense, that should appeal to everybody, right? So for example, if you look at Bala Gangadhar's research program, it's not just Indians who are active in it, right? Okay, I might be somebody, Indian from Kenya or something like that, but there are people from all over the place. There are Europeans, there are people from India, there are people in North America, and so on, right?
And the same with yoga studies.
That's the kind of buy-in you need, right? But it has to be credible and scientific and intellectually credible.
But I want to ask you another question, if I may, because it's very much at the core of some of the conflicts that we've seen with the Cisco case and elsewhere. One of the interesting tropes that's emerged out of these movements that we've been discussing is what is termed as Brahminism. Just this week, there's a conference at the University of California, one of the campuses, on, the title really was, believe it or not, Brahminism, Zionism, and White Supremacy. Let that sink in. Brahminism, Zionism, and White Supremacy. Would either of you like to tell us why exactly there's this obsession with Brahmins and Brahminism? Especially given that if you actually look at the Indian statistics, a great deal of the anti-Dalit violence is by other caste groups, including OBCs. Brahmins hardly feature in this statistical narrative, at least.
Well, Brahmins are the smoke screen behind which, the so-called brokers of backwardness fire, But the simple answer is they're soft targets, on the one hand. But there's a more complex answer. And the more complex answer is that Brahminism is a misnomer. It was invented by the British Orientalists or the European Orientalists to contrast with Buddhism. So they felt that the Buddhists worshipped the Buddha, so they were Buddhists, Buddhism, and the Hindus worshipped Brahman. So Brahminism originally meant the worship of Brahman, which came out of the Upanishads, and the Vedas. And it is only later that it was converted to the rule of Brahmins. It is not Brahminocracy, it never was that. And so it was retooled to attack the entire Sanatana framework by saying, oh, these are the Brahmins, so but I think the anti-Brahmin violence targeting is much deeper. It goes back to the Mughals, it goes back to the missionaries, because in a way they were the, bulwarks, they were the intellectual, you might say, spine of Hindu society. So if you wanted to cut down Hindu society, you had to slash and, end the Brahmins or their prestige in society. And, if you look at the history of the Islamic invasion of India, you see, Buddhism was easier to eliminate because they were monks. And if you could sideline the monks or destroy the monasteries, destroy the viharas, which were the source of livelihood and commerce, then Buddhism could be eliminated easily. And you could break down, you could destroy Nalanda, you could burn the books. Of course, many went to Tibet. But it was more difficult to destroy, so to speak, the Brahmins. Because every home, because this was a householder tradition, manuscripts were preserved in every home. So whether it was whoever wanted to convert India or Hindus, they found that we had to remove this obstacle. Of course, there was all kinds of distortions to the tradition as well, and there were some very corrupt practices. I don't want to, paper over those. We have to be critical of some of those practices, of so-called priestocracy, unscrupulous priests. You still find them in India. So let's not, be apologists and defend everything. But the real point is that if you want to secure Hinduism, then the intellectual, by whatever name, should also be secured and protected and given the freedom and the patronage to function.
Thank you. Prakash, would you like to say something?
I can't deny that there may have been strategic reasons or calculations of all types to eliminate a certain group or minimize its influence in India and so on for all kinds of ulterior reasons. I will just say that the figure of the Brahmin has been a kind of hate figure. It's a kind of ancient hatred, if you like, to coin a phrase. If you go, actually the Greeks were quite fair. I think they regarded the Brahmins as philosophers, and the early Muslims actually took on that kind of take about Brahmins. But the more deep the Muslim influence became in India, you saw a transformation of the image of the Brahmin. One of my colleagues, Duncan Jalke, has done fantastic work on both the Greeks and the Islamic accounts. The Catholics followed suit.
And we'll put a link in the description.
Brilliant. Right. So Catholic accounts actually were not that dissimilar to the later Islamic accounts, which is quite remarkable. I don't know what influence there was between one and the other, but that's a question for further research. It's with the Protestants, the Anglo-Protestants, which I keep talking about, that you got a combination of Hinduism and the caste system. And who was at the top? It was the Brahmins. The Brahmins were meant to be the priests of a false religion. That's how they got kind of classified and characterized. And being priests of a false religion, obviously it meant that they were purveying false doctrines, they were holding people in kind of, they were selling false doctrines as though they were true doctrines. And of course, we all know that the true doctrines at the time were the ones purveyed by the Protestant churches and so on. So when you look at the kind of diatribes that you have today, Stanford University, I found Suraj Yengde's book. I was going to quote from it, but I won't do it, I think, because of the shortness of time. Have a look at Suraj Yengde's book and his chapter on Brahmins and Brahminism. It's a diatribe against Brahmins, right? And he goes so far as to quote Nietzsche. Nietzsche is the philosopher from the 19th century who himself has problems with priesthood and priestcraft. And he includes Brahmins in those. And you should see the level of hate that's expressed in Nietzsche's writing. What does Suraj Yengde do? He's not critical at all. He just adopts it and says, you see, that's how Brahmins are. And so today we are, this ancient hatred is being utilized by the anti-caste activists in a very improper way, I would say. I mean, that's to use a polite term.
Yeah. You have written, actually, one of the persuasive things I saw about your work related to Protestantism and its, skepticism of, high church. And that view taken from European history got then transposed on the Indian context, which I think is a very powerful understanding that you've
The Protestant hatred for priestcraft actually comes about because of a fight that they had in Europe, the Protestants had with the Catholics, and that got transplanted into India. They read India according to a European template, but that's too much detail maybe for us today.
All right, so we're kind of coming to the end, and I've got another sort of biggish question, if I may. Caste is not restricted to Hindus. If anything, when I read the Equality Lab's so-called report, it's a rag, if you ask me, methodologically, one of the things that struck me was that they polled certain groups that they were allies with, certain gurudwaras and mosques and so on. A great deal of the survey came from communities that were not Hindu. And yet, virtually the entire public persona of Equality Labs and their statements, and all the people you mentioned as well, has been directed at Hindus. So it's like, okay, caste is a problem. We will ignore the fact that our informants are actually not Hindus, but we will say that it's a caste as a Hindu problem, ergo we need various kinds of reforms in California legislation, etc. Why is it that the Californian legislators and others, and indeed even the wider public mobilization, did not pick up on this?
Shall I go with that?
Yes, please.
So I think internal to the anti-caste campaign is some kind of cognitive dissonance. See, they're stuck with this old person account, right? So in a way, they have to say that Hindus are at the root of the caste system, whatever it might be, that they're at the root. But if you look at contemporary anthropological accounts, maybe for the last 50, maybe more years, they all accept that actually the key figure in the caste system is the jati. And if you go to India, you know that everybody has jati, not just Hindus have jati, everybody has jati. So they're caught between the devil and the deep blue sea, if I may use that phrasing. And they're constantly battling with that. But I think something else is present as well, which Makrandji already hinted at, which is the prospect of legislation in India, which would sort of mirror SB 403.
I think it's worse, it's more sinister. You blame all the ills on Hindus. You take all the benefits even when you move to Islam or Christianity or Sikhism or wherever. So what's happening?
Hence the move for Dalit status for Christian converts.
Exactly. So you get social upward mobility by becoming Christian, but you keep getting state benefits by sticking to
Dalit.
And you keep blaming the Hindus that you were the ones who made us this way. But the sad thing in that sense is that the remedy has come to inversely mirror the very system it wants to change, because now by birth unto perpetuity you are entitled to unearned benefits, you see. And this is why, whether it's intellectually or cognitively or argumentatively, none of these things can stand, because their internal contradictions are so palpable that you actually begin to see the motivations, which are, in many ways dishonest and anti-merit, anti-meritocracy. So you destroy any idea of merit, you destroy any idea of competence, and then you say the only competence I have is the fact that some ancestor of mine belonged to a particular ascription, And I think that as modern people, we should resist, even if we believe in equality, fraternity, liberty, whatever the modern ideas are, we have to resist these kinds of intellectual forms of intellectual dishonesty, I think.
But you seem to be referring to reservation without using the word.
No, very much. I use the word. I have reservations about reservations, especially the way it is mobilized, and also how they try to equate caste and race. They try to do that so long.
But how has affirmative action come to be seen by the American courts now is quite significant. And I think that might be a good route.
Thank you for that. You've actually written that affirmative action, in the sense of birth-based affirmative action, flies against most international
law. Yes.
Right. This might be a good time actually to go segue to the audience. We've got about half an hour left in today's program. And for that reason, we'd like to get as many voices and questions and comments as possible. I'm going to request you to keep your comments quick and short so that we can get as many voices as possible. Likewise, I'm going to request the gentlemen, both of you, to please keep your responses short as well so we can respect the time, everyone's time. So who wants to go first, please? Just raise your hands and we'll take it to you. And if you could identify yourself first.
So my question to you is, so to solve this problem, right, how do you educate? There are three ways. First is education, because this whole thing, and I'm going to break it down. How do you get them to be more engaged and less apathetic? How do they get to be less self-centered? How do you get them to be somewhat more braver if you're brave? Yeah? Now, why do I say that? I'll clarify. Then
You've got to keep it short, please, because you want to try and get more people.
My point, I think, is any culture, when it tries to understand another culture, misunderstands. Point one. And especially if you have a victor or a ruler, of course, there's a natural element of that. Second, I think we are ignorant of our own culture. And we've been misguided, right? That's the second. And some of us are privileged. Finally, most people are apathetic. And I think most of these crooks succeed and thugs succeed because most people are scared or are apathetic. So how do you see education in waves? Start with people who are privileged or educated, but you need to move to the masses, otherwise pointless. So how do you see a solution to this starting with, I think, your suggestion of, okay, let's start in the US, but how do we make this happen?
Thank you. Please, who would like to go?
You want to go first?
Oh, that was a very packed question. So I don't know exactly how. The last part of your question is about strategy. How do we get things done, particularly in the American context and so on. I'm not really sure if I can address that in any significant way or any relevant way. In the British context, in a way, yes. Looking at it from a British perspective and within Britain, I've mentioned some of the problems that we have. But I think I will return to a response that I made earlier, which is that we lack intellectual wherewithal. That's where, we're good in all kinds of fields. We're actually quite successful people. I'm sure many of you are entrepreneurs. You've made good in the United States and so on. But there is a dimension to our intellectual life which we seem to be lacking, right? Particularly, there's a friend of ours who's not here unfortunately today. He keeps saying, Vamsi Jewelry, of course we all know him. He keeps saying Indians or Hindus have not invested in intellectual lives, particularly the humanities and social sciences. Right? We might be good in STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, medicine, and so on. But how do we view how others see us? Right? So how does the American discourse view us? And how do you counter that? Right? How do you challenge that? And so I revert to my earlier response that we need to have a kind of matured intellectual baseline from which we can kind of depart and respond.
Thank you. Let's get another question, please. Go ahead.
Hi.
Tell us who you are.
Sure. Hi, my name is Mohan Gumalam, and I'm from Palo Alto. So thank you very much for being here and sharing your views and thoughts on this important topic. One of the things that I have come to recognize over the last 1 year. It's more of a comment because I think the solution is very hard for me to even comprehend at this point. But one of the things that I've come to realize over the last year is that there is this Sino-Jihadi leftist alliance that is bent upon destroying Hindus and Indians in general. And the reason why they're alliances, we can think of Sino, which is China has been trying to get on top of the system, and from the left comes Ajit Banga and takes over World Bank, and they lose that battle. So there are millions of such examples. And the jihadis, because they've always tried to dominate Hindus, they haven't been able to. And then leftist, clearly their whole agenda is that if somebody is, there is always an oppressor and oppressed. That is the only way the world exists. And if there are oppressed in India, then there has to be oppressors, and that has to be the Hindus. So it's very clear the lack of understanding that exists. Unfortunately, what has happened over here in the United States, and I'm sorry, I'm going to wrap it up. What has happened here in the United States is 20 years ago, Indians were non-existent. In 20 years since, we have come to take over finance, technology, even the HR departments in many of the companies. This has really driven the scare in people in how quickly we have come to power. And for them, they are getting the funding and the support from everybody around to cut the legs of these Indians who have been growing very fast. That was my comment.
Can I respond briefly?
Yeah, please go ahead.
See, I also want to say you're absolutely right, but I also want to say how our own children are being brainwashed. You saw the example of Riddhi Patel, and there are hundreds of such examples, and going back to the earlier question, what happens is that most people want to stay out of trouble on the one hand. Another set of people want to be popular, want to belong to, the so-called fashionable, liberal, anti-establishment type of causes. Yes. But the answer is that we and our children and everyone around us has to recognize we have skin in the game. That if we don't stand up and defend ourselves, we'll be trampled. Yes. And this is also true about the earlier question, when you said about Brahmins, they're soft targets. Usually they don't retaliate. But lately they've begun to say, if we don't stand up and at least say, no, you're wrong, I disagree with you, then you're gone, and then you can't blame anybody else for your weakness. Yeah. So Vivekananda said, the greatest sin is weakness. So we need strength, Shakti, And Sri Aurobindo has a wonderful, 1905, this great pamphlet he wrote called Bhavani Mandir. And he says what Indians lack is Shakti. What Hindus lack is Shakti. So this is the time to empower ourselves, to empower our children, and also to empower all those who are supporting us. Because when 401B happened, I was in India, I wrote a lot of articles, I even talked to some people, and a lot of people, even in the government, even in the foreign ministry elsewhere, they would say, no, that's not our problem, we don't want to take it on. And I said, tomorrow it's going to come to your doorstep. So they said, we don't want to be seen to take it on. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done behind the scenes to build these alliances. And frankly, let's mention them, RSS, HSS, VHP. Some of these are the only organizations who have had the courage to stand up, and be seen as opposing some of these. And they are the ones who are targeted and stigmatized by the so-called left liberal circles all the time.
Hi, my name is Hiren Shah. Your point about ground-up mobilization, for us to be vigilant, for us to empower, all that, get it, understood, we'll try. But if funding was not an issue, what is one thing, just one thing that you would do to address this or counter these forces? I'll give you a couple of choices to get your thinking going. One is it like we establish equality labs plus 10 times bigger, because obviously they have been successful, or do we create 10 endowment chairs at the biggest universities? If funding was not an issue, resources are not an issue, what is the one thing each one of you would want to do?
I feel a little bit embarrassed because I keep going back to my earlier response, but I think you see the direction in which I'm trying to travel, right? That without investment in intellectual work of a very serious kind, and you have a very prominent activist businessmen based in the United States who keep saying, don't endow chairs to universities blindly. Do your due diligence, right? And so that's where a lot of the responsibility. I know people personally who've given so much money to universities, and it's just going down the drain. And actually they don't even know what kind of results or what kind of research is coming out. It's all this fashionable nonsense which is not advancing knowledge in any way, right? So first test has to be, is it advancing knowledge, right? And is it meeting certain of your strictly chosen criteria? And on that basis, I think you should start to invest in intellectual work, right?
So very quickly, sorry.
Sorry, no, that's it. Yeah,
okay.
sorry.
No, I was going to say there's not just one thing. There's
He
a
asked for
variety
one
of
thing.
things.
He asked for one thing.
I know. So I would invest.
Pick one.
I would invest in strategic thinking of an integrated sort. You want to call it a council of elders or a whatever, an organization of organizations, that a broad base, and we have to think about not 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, but 100 years. That sort of depth of commitment and thought is required. And that should come easily to us. We are Sanatanis. We are Akalis within quotes. We don't have that. We're not trapped in time in the same way as other people are.
Thank you all for such a fascinating discussion. My name is Ramya Ramakrishnan. And some of the questions or thoughts I had have already been answered, so I'm going to keep it really short. Would you both agree that, Sanatan Dharma, because of how tolerant and liberal and broad-minded we've been, it's kind of backfired? And secondly, I can only talk about what's happening here in the US. Even with bills like SB 403, we don't really see people waking up. It's a small group, maybe, extended grassroots groups, but a lot of people are still in deep slumber. And like you said, we have to think about the next 100 years. Our kids are now the soft targets. They're being harassed, bullied, and they're not proud to stand up. Even with, all, so many temples, there's still this advocacy at home that's lacking. I think that every family has to somehow, stand up and become, don the Kshatriya role more. But it's going to take a while, and many families are not, because we are genetically not that, let's pick up the sword and fight, or, let's be confrontational, right? So what is the solution? I know that there may be multiple steps involved. It's not an easy answer, but I'm just curious too.
Yeah, I think too much is made of this so-called intellectual Kshatriya and Kshatriya-hood. Because, as Sri Aurobindo said, without Brahma Tejas, Kshatriya is completely misguided, like Arjuna would have been without Sri Krishna. So we say money's, no, should I say no barrier or no issue, but we do not respect intellectual work. We do not invest in it. We have no India Cultural Fund. We have no fund for Indian, you might say philosophy or Indian traditions. And if you talk to all the big industrialists in India, they don't want to invest in culture. They don't want to invest in thought. They want quick results. They want to buy paintings. They want to put up a museum in their name. They want a chair endowed in their name in an American university. They are not interested in the kind of work we are talking about. They just said, yeah, we get it, but we will do something else. Because, you see, they want something out of it. They want to become famous. They want to be recognized. And our intellectual caliber, we want to be Vishwaguru, but, we don't even know ourselves. We don't have Atmabodh. Forget about having Shatrubodh. So, as an intellectual or as an academic or as a professor or as a writer or as a thinker, I don't want to quickly say, we have to be a Rajasic nation. Try and be a Sattvic nation, try and be what you're supposed to be a little bit. And that itself we don't do. And I'm from JNU, and JNU was a left citadel. It was the last place outside of Cuba, whatever you want to say. And they've destroyed that citadel, for good or bad, and now you have the so-called right-wingers everywhere in JNU. But saying Jai Shri Ram or Bharat Mata Ki Jai does not make you an intellectual. It can get you a job. But if you ask somebody to read a text or understand a tradition more than 50 years old, they don't know anything. So this is the quick fix that won't work. Just changing attitude. Garv se kaho hum Hindu hai. These kinds of slogans and shibboleths are not going to solve the problem. The hard work. And at home, by the way, it's not as hard as you think. When there was a national movement, every home had a rebel. Because everyone had internalized this idea that the British had to go. So if every home internalizes the idea that there's something wonderful about our tradition, there's something wonderful about Sanatana Dharma, and it's for everyone, and we practice it, the change, the transformation, becoming yogis, becoming masters, or even dasa. Dasatva can be great if you know what it is. Bhakti itself is a Mahabhava. The rasa theory. You know, all of these are wonderful, and if we understand and appreciate it, it leads to human flourishing. It's not about East or West, you know, and it's for everyone. It's also for the Chinese, you know, it's also for the Muslims, it's for everyone. Indian classical music, Hindustani music is a beautiful blend. So if we show all of this, it will come automatically, and there'll be a pushback which doesn't have to be militant. Not to say that we don't need a few militant pushbacks, but it can be a very different pushback.
Just to add to Ramya's question about how do we help our kids be very comfortable with the Hindu...
Tell us who you are first.
My name is Venki. I'm the resident of Palo Alto. My question is about helping our kids be very comfortable with their Indian identity and Hindu identity. And growing up in India, we were very... it was common to see Catholic schools or Christian schools, right? They are considered like a good education. And to me, it seems like here... my question is about, are there role models for us to follow at a school level? And what I was thinking is like either middle school, high school kind of a thing, where equivalent of a Catholic school that we saw in India. Are there other countries that have done it well, or other cities that we can follow here in the Bay Area?
I think we're doing it. There's Chinmaya schools, there are schools of that kind, and in Britain, I think they've followed a very interesting pattern, which is Sunday school, have Hindu Sunday school. And in the community, we need classes for chanting, for reading texts, which we should ourselves participate. And I want to also say this, let's not become very solemn. It should be fun, there should be rasa, there should be rasanubhava. It should be enjoyable. We can start with the Matrix, we can start with Star Wars. We can say, you know what, the Jedi are actually yogis. You know, Master Yoda, who is Master Yoda? He's a Yeti. You know what, we have to find ways to engage the young people, I feel. We don't have to get so solemn and scared or whatever. We have to expand ourselves, and we should make this so attractive, so cool for everyone, you know. And I think that is the way. And I think that doing things at home, you know, making dishes, you know, which are interesting, getting, you know, there's hundreds of ways to get into our own tradition, I feel.
Good evening. My name is Vandana Ramakrishnan, and I'm very fascinated by all that you had to share. So I realized there are a lot of moving parts in what was discussed today. You know, there was the Brahmanism and the casteism and the politicism. Now, what I want to know, because I also have grown kids with whom I'm struggling to convey why Hindus are not as bad as they are made out to be in their own textbooks. That was a wake-up call for me, by the way. And I myself, growing up, I thought Akbar was the greatest thing because of his Din Ilahi. I knew nothing about the Chola Empire, but I knew everything about the Mughal Empire. So moving on, what are your thoughts on mobilizing the grassroots movement here, where Hindus are not afraid to be Hindus, where Hindus don't directly connect it somehow to Brahmanism and casteism, because I think that's where the confusion is coming these days, right? So how do we de-link the two, or what are your ideas on how we can de-link the two so that we can bring more people into the fold who will believe that this is a good way to be, a right way to be, a powerful way to be? Either of you can take it.
So, see, today also, one of the problems that we got ourselves into is to talk negatively about Brahmins, right? I mean, we are worried about this, but we still only talk about negatively about Brahmins. We don't know what Brahmins are. Actually, if you look at the Indian traditions, all the discourses, the disputations and so on, a lot of that was about what is Brahminhood, what makes a Brahmin. This was not a set question in India, right? There was constant debate about it, right? And so this is one of the things we have to discover, right? This is not going to be easy solution, you know, I can just tell my child this slogan and everything will be fine. It's not going to be like that, right? Again, it's a task for research. But one thing which is missing here is also a confession that we have to understand the West better. We don't know the West, right? It's not knowing, it's not just about knowing our traditions and being unapologetic about it and all of that sort of stuff, convincing our children of this and that. We have to understand the West, because otherwise we don't know how different we are from the West. You know, and my guru, if I may say so, S.N. Balagangadhara, he constantly says this, you know, he constantly repeats this issue, that we just don't know the West, right? Which is part of the reason why we fail to formulate responses, because we don't know in what terms they think, and we don't know in what terms they've thought about us. And today the image we have of ourselves is one which is given to us. It's not our image. Right? So if you don't know the entity which created that image about yourself, how can you actually think through what your problem is? So that's the task for today.
Would you like to say something?
Yeah, I want to say just one very interesting thing what Prakash Bhai was also saying. You know, the question of who or what is a Brahmin has been a perennial question. And I had a Dalit student who, you know, did his PhD with me, and he came into my office and said, you know, all this Brahminism same sort of thing. And he self-identifies as the Buddhist. So I said, okay, let's read a Buddhist text. So we took out the Dhammapada, and it has 2 chapters on what is a Brahmin. Yeah. And when he read it, his eyes opened. He said, this is not the kind of Buddhist I was taught to be.
Exactly.
For me, Buddhism was only social activism. It was not an inquiry into the nature of reality. And so these are very interesting. I mean, it was a learning experience, you know, in both directions. So what I'm simply saying is that let's not assume that we know just because we are proud to be Hindus. The moment I get a question from somebody, I want to say, okay, let's go into it. You think this way, tell me how you are saying this and who's told you, what's the source, and let's look at it. So I'm a great believer in Anvikshiki because it cuts across all disciplines in India. It's in Chanakya, it's in the Mahabharata, you know, it's in the Upanishads, it's also in the Charaka Samhita. So Anvikshiki is an investigative procedure to find the truth. And I'm afraid that even on the so-called committed, so to speak, right side, so-called right side, there's no Anvikshiki, there's no questioning. And I ask in India, like, what is the space of criticism in this new India, Naya Bharat that you're making? There is no criticism, it's only obedience, or it's only a different kind of party line. And that is not something that I'm in favor of, because I think Sanatana Dharma, he said, is self-correcting. It's self-correcting because of that inbuilt critical component.
Thank you very much. We're almost at the close, so I just wanted to make a couple of very quick remarks at the end. I think the first thing that struck me, hearing the two of you gentlemen and having seen and read some of your works and indeed others, is how much the vast majority of us are actually Macaulay's children. How little we understand our own traditions, how little we know. And it's because of this veil of ignorance that a lot of falsehoods that we've been discussing right through this entire discussion are perpetrated. Yeah. So the first thing that comes to me, of course, is that the greatest act of activism, I feel, can be a real commitment collectively and individually to a quest for truth, which has been disavowed. I mean, part of the academia today, and the social sciences in particular, explicitly attacks the idea of truth. But that's not who we are as a culture. That's not who the Greeks were. This is a relatively recent phenomenon. And it's this quest for truth needs to be addressed systemically. Whether we're able to do it in institutions like universities or not is an open question. We should try it. But certainly there's got to be an attempt at the community level. We've got to put our heads in doing that. Among other things, it means minimally ourselves making an attempt at learning languages, finding the teachers to learn things and so on. The second thing, when I heard the two of you today, is what this quest really entails. Makrand, you spent Your books don't come from anywhere. When I looked at your CV and reading your work, I made a joke that it's like ChatGPT, except that it sucked up the entire universe of libraries. And that's evident in the way in which you talked as well. But this kind of scholarship comes from 50 years or whatever of dedicated work with very little reward. And one of the tragedies of the modern age is that a system or a culture that paid so much respect to the idea of the guru has completely disavowed it. We all have, and we chase money. So there's a kind of a critical need to, in a sense, go back to respecting scholarship, the kind of hard-earned work that takes with little or no monetary reward. But people like this. Emerging scholars need to be funded. So there's got to be, to go back to the question about what is the one thing you would do, I'd say find the means through which young people who are interested in these sorts of things can sustain themselves. Maybe we need an educational foundation that does this in a quite a systematic way. And I think the last thing that has become very clear to me, that speaks to both of these things as well, is the desperate need to change, to save not just a wider culture. It's not India we're talking about. It's one of the world's few traditions that, if you believe in the idea of diversity, in the idea of a plurality of thought, for the sake of humanity itself to have other ideas, then this enormously interesting and historically rich corpus of thought and action somehow needs to be preserved. And for that, it is crucial to save our children to begin with. We've got to find ways in which what kind of brainwashing that groups like Equality Labs have been doing in the universities are contested. We need to go back and to the grassroots and find ways of educating people so that they can become ambassadors and push back. So those are my three thoughts. I thank both the guests, Makrand and Prakash, for coming here from significant distances. I thank all of you for coming here as well, for asking and making such pertinent points. And I hope that we can continue this in the due course of time as well. Thank you very much.